This game sucks, but you knew that. I mean, look at it. Most Wanted's DS port is as bad to play as it is to look at. It combines only the worst elements of the other handheld ports, losing the best elements of its source material in the process. This story has a little bit of everything. Missed deadlines, tax evasion, snake oil salesmen, and multiple criminal convictions. Let's take it from the top. Sensory Sweep Studios was a small game company from Salt Lake City, Utah. The company's early days were spent developing a smattering of handheld games, as was fitting for a staff comprised largely of people who previously worked for Sapphire. One of these Sapphire defectors was a man named Dave Rushton, whose brother, Hal Rushton, had headed up Sapphire during his time with the company. Out of the gate, they made a pair of Yu Yu Hakusho GBA games with Metacritic scores that don't even earn a B- if you add them together. Their working relationship with Electronic Arts began soon after, when they developed the DS conversion of Tiger Woods 2005, which landed pretty squarely in 5 out of 10 territory. They quickly cranked out a poker game and a port of Marvel Nemesis, but the game for which they are most infamous is the Nintendo DS conversion of Need for Speed Most Wanted, released day and date with all other versions. Were this any other game, I'd probably start off by giving a bit of background on the lead version, but that's not really necessary. For one, you probably know what Need for Speed Most Wanted is and why it's so well regarded. I also don't think I need to dwell on the immediately apparent flaws with this version. Most Wanted's DS port isn't even a shock to look at anymore. It's been mocked in enough videos. So, rather than dogpile the low-hanging fruit, I want to explore the game in earnest. It's bad, but beyond the obvious, why is it bad? Unsurprisingly, the answers are numerous, and they're not particularly deep-seated. The driving physics are, without exaggeration, the worst I've ever encountered, and believe me, that is a low, low bar to clear. Most Wanted for DS feels like driving drunk. Cars are twitchy and imprecise, with over and understeer alternating at seemingly random points. There's really no way to predict how sharply the car will turn with any given input. Going into a maneuver, I have no idea if I'm going to careen into the wall, or if the car will grip so much the momentum is thrown out of the window as it completes the turn. Even on the straights, the hyperactive steering creates scenarios where collisions are unavoidable, in part because traffic and obstacle hitboxes are larger than the models they're attached to, and because objects that look like you should be able to drive through them are actually filled with cement. But more than that, I feel that the steering's touchiness makes you afraid to use it. You'll gingerly suggest evasive maneuvers, and the reaction will really be enough to avoid an accident that, if I didn't tell you this, would look like a case of target fixation. But the alternative is to steer hard and invariably hit something else, ending up with the same result. These problems compound with the game's police, which, unlike the main version of the game, subtract from the appeal. They're obnoxious rubber-banding missiles that bounce off the wall like a child on their third can of Red Bull. Beyond crashing into you, they also drop these spike strips on the ground. Regardless of how it manifests, this constant, unavoidable loss of momentum is consistently frustrating, and it draws attention to the miserably slow acceleration of every vehicle on offer. Maybe acceleration is the wrong word though. If you believe the speedometer, the cars in Most Wanted DS are actually quite quick. The issue is that 150 miles per hour indicated speed looks and feels like 50. 50 feels like 10. And unlike a lot of handheld and early console games, that's not a result of slowdown. Most Wanted maintains a pretty respectable 60 frames most of the time. The game just manages to completely lack a sense of speed. Maybe it's something to do with the scale of the world, but at any rate, constantly colliding with that world and random obstacles in it makes the game's already difficult gameplay feel insurmountable. Don't misunderstand, it is definitely surmountable, but it's a matter of trial and error rather than skill. The AI rubber band even harder than black boxes, and that is once again saying something. Earlier, I mentioned how many videos have used Most Wanted's DS port as a punchline, and that observation was the basis for my approach to this review. That said, it's not really a complaint. I don't blame anyone for not wanting to complete the game. I mean, would you? This is the part where I'm supposed to tell you that I decided to take one for the team, that I decided to complete Most Wanted DS in its entirety. And viewer, believe me, I tried, but it was just too strong. Part of the reason this video took so long to come out is that I genuinely struggled to will myself to sit at my desk, 3DS in hand, and choke down more of this game. Every minute I spent playing, I felt myself take a point of psychic damage. Fuck you, game! Most Wanted for DS is about a dozen hours long, yet nothing really changes at all over that duration. It all feels like the same 5 minutes of gameplay over and over. Even when well-rested, generously caffeinated, in a voice call with friends, and watching YouTube videos in the background, Most Wanted for DS was literally lulling me to sleep.
This seems very dull.
Yes.
Past the halfway point, the hours I dumped into this thing were solely for the sake of footage variety. No new information, opinion, or insight was granted. I repeatedly flip-flopped on whether or not my commitment to the bit was strong enough to complete the last third, even as I was already editing the original iteration of this video. Thankfully, the decision was made for me when a blacklist racer began rubber banding so aggressively that I'm not sure the race is winnable unless they were to get stuck. And while that can and does happen, I'm not about to sit here retrying this 45-second race over and over until it does. So, no, I've not finished this game, but I do think I've played far more of it than most. I'm halfway convinced that the absolute madman that uploaded a 100% complete save file to GameFAQs is the only person to ever actually complete it. Point is, you're not seeing endgame footage because I didn't get to the endgame. I detected no hint that the game would change drastically, or really at all, in the remaining 4 hours of runtime. That might sound pretty obvious, but it's not necessarily a given. When I reviewed Most Wanted 510, the PSP equivalent of this game, my complaints were less severe, but not dissimilar. Had I not reached endgame though, I wouldn't have reached the conclusion that I did in that video. 510 was structured backwards. If the tracks from the beginning of the game were placed into the later stages and vice versa, Most Wanted 510 would have felt far more competent than it did. The issues with handling, police, and rubber banding I've noted so far in this review were also present in 510, but the core of the experience was more or less intact. This isn't the case with Most Wanted for DS. These problems are so severe that it renders the game nearly unplayable at its core. No matter what car, track, or mode you select, the issues will snowball, and you will have a bad time. Even if the endgame was better, it would still belong to the worst racing game on the DS. And look, I've played quite a few downgraded ports and handheld spin-offs over the years, and I've even covered a fair few of them on this channel. And every time, without fail, someone feels the need to comment something along the lines of,
It's a DS game! What did you expect?
And while I understand the sentiment, what those people don't get is that there are plenty of interesting, well-thought-out ports and remakes out there, not to mention original titles, all of which prove that the DS is capable of accommodating decent game design. In the case of Most Wanted, though, I don't have to discuss Grid, Trackmania, or Mario Kart to make my point. I only need to look to the previous game in this very series. Underground 2's DS port was developed by Pocketeers, the same studio responsible for all of the series' GBA ports. And, as it turns out, developing ambitious games for a limiting platform means that scaling that ambition to more powerful hardware can result in seriously impressive work. Underground 2's gameplay isn't exactly mind-blowing from a design standpoint, but it is solid, especially considering that this was the studio's first DS game and that it released so early in the DS's lifespan, landing in July of 2005. Wait. This raises questions. If Underground 2's DS port was going to release almost a full year after the game proper, why not have that team work on Most Wanted instead? And if this released in July, had Most Wanted even entered its development stage? I know these are different developers, but it just seems like such a bizarre decision to do things this way. Why contract Pocketeers to build a Need for Speed DS game and then not have them make the follow-up? Wouldn't it have been easier, cheaper, and safer to slap new assets on top of this, rather than pay an unqualified studio to make this? That's like Business 101, so what happened? I've done my diligence attempting to contact people from Sensory Sweep to talk about this game. I've found 0 active social media accounts for anyone involved, with the only exceptions being the Rushtons, who I'm not going to contact for reasons that will become very clear momentarily. However, I did manage to get in touch with the developer from Pocketeers, and while obviously they could only shed light on the game that they made, I learned things that filled in a lot of the logical gaps in Most Wanted's development. I'm told that when work began on Underground 2's DS port, the DS's final specs hadn't been released to third-party developers. When those specs finally came out, they were far more advanced than Pocketeers and EA had foreseen, and so development pivoted from an enhanced port of the GBA version to an entirely new version of the game. This necessitated the creation of a bespoke new engine, new models and textures, new tracks, and touchscreen minigames. It would be a lot to drop onto any developer, much less one that had yet to make a game for the DS. So, quite understandably, Underground 2 released late. I'm not really sure how behind schedule the game's release was. I doubt it was intended as a DS launch title, but I could see it landing in March alongside Underground Rivals for PSP. Regardless though, I'm told that EA was displeased with the game's tardy completion, and that this tardiness was the reason that the publisher elected to award the contract for Most Wanted to Sensory Sweep instead of Pocketeers. In retrospect, I'm sure someone at EA kicked themselves pretty hard for that call, and yeah, it was a really bad one. Pocketeers' tech was really impressive, and I'm sure that given a chance to polish it up and focus more on the game itself, they could have made something even better. But even if the contract had to be given to someone else, it was clear that Sensory Sweep were an awful fit. They hadn't made any racing games at all, much less DS ones, so not only did they have to make their own engine, they had to learn how to design racing games in the first place, work with limited information and communication with Black Box, and all while juggling a multitude of other projects in the months leading up to release. Problems that Pocketeers had spent years learning to navigate or outright eliminating from their workflow. I don't know when the final call to hire Sensory Sweep was made, but I'm comfortable calling it summer of 2005, so at best 5 months. And even with a timeline that short, the company was so busy playing game dev Diner Dash that most of it wasn't spent focused on Most Wanted. If someone from Sensory Sweep comments on this video and tells me that they made this game in 2 months, I'll buy it. It's much easier to believe that a game this uninspired was the result of insufficient time and resources than to acknowledge the notion that a team of human beings could make something this bad with their whole ass behind it. And having discovered the story of this company, I wouldn't even be surprised. As it turns out, Sensory Sweep was in deep financial trouble from its very first year in existence. As soon as May of 2003, the company wasn't paying for its unemployment insurance, which is something that American companies are legally required to do. Come early 2005, this landed the company in serious legal and financial trouble, and Sensory Sweep LLC would declare bankruptcy in September of that year, 2 months before Most Wanted's release. But wait, I hear you say. They released tons of games after this. How did a bankrupt company continue pumping out shitty video games for 3 more years? And you see, that's where you're wrong. Those games were not produced by Sensory Sweep LLC. They were produced by a different company, formed 6 months before the bankruptcy, and that company's name was Sensory Sweep Studios, not Sensory Sweep LLC. Employees came into work one day and, without even realizing it, performed their duties for an entirely different company than the day before. Paperwork, payroll, contracts, all of it was rolled into the new business, and they did not tell a soul. Staff who had been there for the switcheroo recall receiving 2 W-2 forms for 2005, one from each of the 2 entities, and any inquiry as to why was hand-waved away. As if that was not bad enough, and I promise I'm not making this up, they did this twice, shuffling their employees to an LLC called FoopTube a year later. The shady dealings grew in both number and severity over the ensuing years, but they only began coming to light in late 2008, after a small game publisher called Brash Entertainment closed its doors. Brash had previously commissioned Sensory Sweep to make such bangers as Alvin and the Chipmunks and The Tale of Despero, and when they went under, they apparently still owed Sensory Sweep over $2 million. Dave Rushton knew this was bad, but he was determined to navigate this crisis without firing anyone. He promised his employees that the company would recover, and continued hiding the reality of the situation from all of them. In the short term, Rushton technically kept his promise. He didn't fire anyone, he just wasn't paying them. According to Kotaku, the only people Sensory Sweep was paying were Dave Rushton himself, family members that worked for him, and a select few friends. In December of 2008, employees filed complaints to the United States Department of Labor in an attempt to recoup what was, at that point, over 100 days of unpaid wages, and this is when things came crashing down. In January of 2009, the Department of Labor came back with an injunction claiming that Sensory Sweep owed over $2 million in unpaid wages to just 200 employees. That is $10,000 per person. By April, Rushton and his wife were facing a grab bag of felony charges for failure to file tax returns, tax evasion, unlawful dealing of property, communications fraud, and racketeering. Now, I do think it's important to temper our criticism of Mr. Rushton a little bit here, because nobody, not even his bitterest employees, thought the man's thievery was in pursuit of personal monetary gain. In the words of his own lawyer, there were no luxury cars or fancy houses. The man drove a minivan. It's clear that Rushton's crimes were born of perceived necessity, a way to keep the lights on so that Sensory Sweep could eventually pay the workers what they were owed, and in that way, it's tempting to say his refusal to fire anyone in the wake of Brash's closure was a noble if misguided decision. But by the time that decision was made, Rushton had already been stealing from his employees for years just to keep the company afloat. Keep in mind, that $2 million the Department of Labor claimed Rushton owed his employees was just wages. It doesn't include the other ways in which he directly stole from them or indirectly caused them financial hardship. One former employee told Kotaku that, despite deducting Social Security taxes from employees' pay, SensorySweep didn't pay those taxes for the entirety of 2007, meaning that the employees themselves now owed an entire year's worth of deductions despite having already paid them, and were thus under considerable pressure from the IRS to cough up the cash. In that same vein, employees noticed that their 401k contributions were being deducted from their pay, but weren't being paid into their pensions. When employees confronted company leadership, the deductions did stop, but they wouldn't commit to reimbursing those stolen funds, and they ultimately never did so, with a federal suit being filed in 2010 over that particular element of the scam. One individual told the media that SensorySweep had stopped paying premiums for its employees' dental insurance, something he found out only after having thousands of dollars of work done under the pretense that it would be covered by his work benefits. He said he was also behind on his mortgage due to SensorySweep's failure to pay his salary, and both of these blows came on top of the missing Social Security taxes. This particular employee would go on to declare bankruptcy because of these hardships. Every moment these people spent working for SensorySweep was destroying their lives, not just through debt accrued due to Rushton's dishonesty, but also on a personal level. Employees published a website in January of 2009 that exposed the company's financial crimes, but it also detailed a work environment wrought with impossible deadlines, forced crunch, and continual lies on the part of Rushton and his leadership. It's impossible to say he did anyone a favor by continuing to employ them. In 2010, Dave Rushton was sentenced to 6 months in prison for the federal charges of tax fraud and racketeering, with an additional year-long sentence for non-payment of wages, the first time the state of Utah had prosecuted someone for that particular crime since the 1990s. So he went to jail, served his time, and came out a changed man, newly moral and scrupulous, and worked an honest job. Rushton's probation expressly prohibited him from handling other people's money, a really vague terminology that I believe barred him from so much as being a cashier. And, in fairness, I wouldn't trust this fuck with McDonald's cash register either. So after his apparently early release in 2013, he claims to have taken on a senior developer position with a company called Jamberry. Jamberry was what's called a mid-level marketing company. Businesses like this rely on non-employee salespeople. You might be familiar with Mary Kay, which is a notable example. These freelancers earn a commission on what they sell and are encouraged to recruit friends and family into the fold. MLMs are legal, but they're definitely ethically shady, very closely resembling pyramid schemes. The freelance status of the salespeople is used to get away with all sorts of things that would be illegal to do to actual employees. So that's already not a great start for Mr. Rushton's post-prison career, but hey, stable employment is hard to come by for an ex-con. He remained with the company for 5 years, until Jamberry suddenly closed in 2018. Salespeople were given zero notice that their jobs were going away, though the company had a somewhat documented history of delaying or outright failing to pay employees. Wait a fucking minute. Now, I am not saying that Rushton had anything to do with this, but I am saying that it bears a suspicious resemblance to the company that landed him in prison, and his new gig really isn't much better. He's working for a company called Juva. And as a little side tangent, it's always a good sign when you load up a company's website, and you can't tell what the fuck they do. Like, the last time I saw a site this generic and vague, it was a marketing front for Marlboro. Juva is, in fact, another mid-level marketing scheme, and kind of the opposite of Marlboro, funny enough. Unlike Jamberry, which sold legitimate, if tacky, beauty supplies, Juva sells supplements, drinking water supplies, and other health items. Almost every single one of these product pages is full of jargon, buzzwords, and pseudoscience. If you care to inspect Juva's bio-intense anti-aging spray, for example, scrolling down to the benefits section of the page reveals that every single one of them has an asterisk next to it. By far my favorite of their products is the Kacey Shield, this little sticker-looking thing you're supposed to stick to your phone or carry on your person. It's a proprietary combination of precious stones and minerals that emit negative ions naturally to neutralize harmful, positively charged frequencies like EMFs. No, it's magical healing crystals for people who do CrossFit. This page swears up and down that electromagnetic fields cause cancer or pain or whatever might be ailing you, but there is zero evidence to support that. The testimonial section is full of fake reviews claiming that buying 4 Kacey Shields fixed chronic pain that had ailed them for decades. So, no, Rushton did not learn from his mistakes and turn a new leaf. He simply learned how to scam people legally, and I mean, That's the American dream right there. Oh yeah, the kicker to all this? Dave's brother Hal was the president of Sapphire when non-payment lawsuits were filed and won by employees years before Sensory Sweep opened. Seems it runs in the family. It's not really possible, nor ethical for me to dig into the personal lives of these people beyond what's known about their crimes. However, if I were to do so, I suspect there's probably some close personal connection between Rushton and people at both Jamberry and Juva. Both companies are located near Salt Lake City, and it's not a stretch to imagine that Dave networked his way into these jobs, given the Rushton family's affinity for exploitative business practices. And if you were curious, Hal is currently the senior software engineer for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Because apparently the Mormon Church retains multiple software engineers. This video was supposed to be about Need for Speed. In truth, I considered cutting out the entire review section of this video because as you've just seen, it's the least interesting part of this story. But this game was the catalyst for the company's failure. Bankruptcy and lawsuits notwithstanding, Sensory Sweep never worked for Electronic Arts again after 2005. EA retained companies like Firebrand and Exient Entertainment for years for the sole purpose of making cynical products for lesser platforms. Expectations were low. So, for Electronic Arts to fire your studio after 1 year of partnership, the problem lies within, y'all. Sensory Sweep would never work with anyone near EA's magnitude ever again. And had they not lost such a crucial customer, they might have ended up like Exient or Firebrand. Rockstars? No. But operational? Probably. And without anyone going to prison. Pepsi or Coca-Cola? Coke, unless it's Wild Cherry Pepsi. Opinion of the new Need for Speed comic art style? I love it. 2015 already did the underground look, and the daytime driving in Payback and Heat looked less than stellar, so if dramatically upgrading the tech is out of the question, I'm glad that's at least giving way to a new, more creative approach. What franchises or games do you wish never died? Ridge Racer. It's far past time for a new game. What's a feature that appeared in a franchise once and then never made an appearance again that you wish was carried over to other games? Counter-Strike Condition Zero's single-player mode was actually pretty good, and I wish we got something like it in Source and Global Offensive. I liked the team-building mechanic, and I felt that it could have been fleshed out to give Counter-Strike something akin to a terrorist hunt experience. But Condition Zero's disastrous development and reception, and that of similar competitive shooter spin-offs, means that we're unlikely to see it attempted in the future.